Good morning. I wanted to finish up Chapter 9 on speciation. What I've done is I divided up my second video into two parts, an A and a B, just so I could not be rushed and try to go through something real fast. So you will find that I will have 4 videos for Chapter 9. There'll be a 1, then there'll be a 2A, a 2B, and then 3. Okay, so Part 1 was on convergent, divergent, and parallel evolution. Part 2A was on adaptive radiation. And what is speciation? This part 2B, is going to be called the mechanisms and different types of speciation, and video 3 talks about reproductive isolating mechanisms, just to give a little outline. Okay, so one of the primary ways, and maybe the most easy way to speak of speciation occurring, is by geographic isolation. So a geographic barrier forms, and in doing so provides a pathway for 2 species, or perhaps even more, to form via this barrier that separates populations from one another and thus inhibits them, potentially anyway, or most likely inhibits them from mating with one another. So this is referred to as allopatric speciation. So allopatric speciation is the formation of a new species due to the separation of an ancestral population due to this geographic barrier. So a geographic barrier could be a lake, a river, mountain chain, an ocean, even could be a specific kind of habitat or environment, if you will. A desert, as one example. So in allopatric speciation, you have an original population, an ancestral population, if you will. That population is separated by some barrier. If speciation does occur, it is often considered that these populations will develop some reproductive isolating mechanism of some sort, where the populations would not mate with one another if they were brought back in contact with one another. That doesn't always hold, needless to say, and hybrids between one population and another can occur. So, speciation is considered to occur if the original population and the new population are reproductively isolated. Though, again, the ability for populations, if they come back in contact with one another, to produce hybrids does exist, especially in plants. So nothing is perfect in the world, and speciation is certainly not as well. If gene flow between the separated or isolated populations is reduced to near zero, that certainly might be more plausible on an island. If the ancestral population is from a mainland and the new species that form from geographic isolation are on islands or an island, think of Hawaii, then gene flow between a mainland and an island population might be reduced to near zero. The important thing to think here in this mechanism is that you have an initial population. This population gets split into subpopulations by some geographic barrier. Those subpopulations, the mating between them is reduced to near zero, and movement of genes between these isolated populations is thought to be reduced to near zero. Different characteristics might develop, including mating characteristics, mating behaviors, maybe even physical characteristics of the organisms themselves based on the genetic diversity in those populations when they were isolated. And the overall outcome might be one or more, maybe many different species, depending upon the degree of reproductive isolation that exists if the populations are brought back in contact with one another and they cannot mate with one another and form hybrids due to the development of isolating mechanisms. That is the topic of video 3. Geographic isolation is not the only way that a new species can form from an ancestral population. So let's look at some other ways that a new species is thought to perhaps be able to form. Peripatric speciation is an example of a special type of allopatric speciation, when the population that becomes geographically isolated exists with just a very few individuals. This is often considered to be the case in Hawaii, where one or two colonizing individuals, and I'm thinking of plants, are considered to be the initial colonists of just a few individuals. And in some cases in Hawaii, adaptive radiation has occurred, that from a few initial colonizing plants, 20, 30 or more different species, even different genera, have developed. And I'm thinking in particular of some members of the daisy family, the sunflower family, and some members of a family that's called the Lobelia family, the Campanula family, called bellflowers or bellworts. So peripatric speciation is when the population that becomes isolated from the ancestral or original population only has a few individuals. That's considered to be a means of speciation for the island of Hawaii, the island chain of Hawaii. Sympatric speciation is a means of forming a new species that is directly in the range of the original population. So allopatric speciation in this figure shows the origin of a mountain chain that separates populations on either side of it, using pale and darker green to represent. The pale green represents a new species that forms, and the darker green represents the original population, the original species, if you will. This can be supported today with the use of DNA analysis, electrophoresis, polymerase chain reaction, and doing base pair sequences, just like we talked about in Chapter 6. Sympatric speciation shows that this pale green population becomes reproductively isolated within the same range of the ancestral population or species, that you do not have a geographic barrier that presents a way of limiting gene flow, if you will, between the populations. So, you might say, well, what causes reproductive isolation? And again, this will be a topic of video 3. Maybe the population here breeds at a different time or reproduces at a different time. Maybe this is a special habitat, a specialized environment. Maybe since we're talking plants here, trees, maybe the pollen of this particular population in light green, maybe it will not fuse with the egg of this darker green. Maybe the gametes won't fuse, is what I'm saying. So there's several different types of reproductive isolation that might develop. It could be time involved, it could be habitat or ecology, it could be even at the level of the gametes not fusing. Here's a couple other ways. Here's a couple more ways on this slide. In the example of sympatric speciation, I gave you a couple examples from the previous slide of breeding at different times, living in different environments, habitats, having different niches, different roles. So this slide talks of two more ways. Number one, I'll just start at the bottom. Polyploidy. A population doubles its chromosome numbers, as you see in the what's called bread wheat, Triticum aestivum. And by doubling the chromosome number, which is a type of chromosomal mutation that's called an aneuploidy, and in this case, by doubling them, it's referred to as a type of aneuploidy called polyploidy, where the chromosome number is doubled. It could be quadrupled for that matter. So bread wheat, which you eat with bread, that's a little different species than the type of wheat that is used to make pasta. That's a harder flour, if you will, a different species. But bread wheat is a polyploid that developed from two ancestral species that formed a hybrid that was sterile and had 21 chromosomes, and bread wheat doubled its chromosome number from 21 to 42 and became a sexually reproducing species. So polyploidy is considered a means of forming a new species within the geographic range of an original or several original populations. Lichens, as a group of composite organisms of a fungus and an alga, lichens show what is referred to as genetic polymorphisms. And the lichen picture in the top right is of a group of species that are called pixie cup lichens or goblet cup lichens, fairy cups because of their small size. They have developed different genetic populations that contain different organic molecules that can only be determined by chemical analysis. So species formation in certain kinds of lichens has actually occurred by different expression of genes to produce different types of organic molecules within the body of the lichen. So that is referred to as a genetic polymorphism, the development of genetic variation within different populations. And in the case of lichens, it can only be determined by a chemical analysis. So speciation occurring without a geographic barrier, without geographic isolation to prevent reproduction. So I gave you several different ways. Time, different habitats, ecology, mechanical, the parts don't fit, the genitalia, and then polyploidy, doubling the chromosome number, and genetic polymorphisms. Okay. So lastly, it's called parapatric speciation. Two species form by being partially separated. So one population begins to live in a different niche, different habitat, takes on a different role in that habitat, still contains a area of overlap with the original population, and in areas where they do overlap, hybrids can form, but in areas where they don't overlap, they maintain their identities. And Here are two species of orioles to illustrate that form of species.